All right, good afternoon. So what we're going to do here is take a very quick run through the basic arguments of both Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. For the test, you are expected to be able to understand both of these, although you don't have to quote them. The best way to use this video is to take out the copies of Federalist 10 and 51 that I distributed in class, and then make sure to go through those as I'm walking through each step in the argument. I won't necessarily quote the papers as I move through, because that would take far too much time, but if you follow along carefully and pause this video, you should be able to follow the arguments as we go. So the first step in Madison's argument is to explain that the Articles government is unstable and unjust, and that the cause of this is factions. This is a very long section for two very simple points. What Madison is trying to do here is get people to buy into his argument. It's very difficult for the Federalists to make sure that everyone believes their initial view, which is that the Articles government is unstable and unjust, that it causes problems, and that there's a cause of this that can be solved by a new constitution in order to resolve the differences between the states, in order to create a new method of representation in Congress. So this whole section is a little bit longer than these two basic ideas would suggest, but it has some of Madison's most interesting sort of rhetorical methods of trying to get people to buy into his argument, so it's worth spending some time on. However, much more important for the substantive argument here in Fed 10 is what Madison does next. He says, well, if the problem is faction, we're going to define faction, and remember we talked about this definition of faction in class for quite some time, and Madison lays it out for you very simply, right, that factions are majorities or minorities who have either something that's detrimental to the aggregate interest of the whole or to the rights of the citizens in mind. You can either remove the cause of faction or you can try and mitigate the effects of faction. And Madison's argument is just so simple and logical. He says we can't remove the basic causes of faction, and he gives a large number of reasons. This takes several paragraphs. First, he says it would remove basic liberties if we tried to remove faction, because people will be factional unless you give them no freedom to create factions. And even if you tried to remove the causes of faction by enlightening citizens or making people more educated or thoughtful, that still wouldn't work, because there are really basic elements of society that create factions, according to Madison. Things like people being rich and poor, having different amounts of property, people having different regard for leaders who are more or less charismatic, different religious beliefs, desire for personal fame or ambition. All of these things are, for Madison, the reason you can't remove the causes of faction. Similarly, Madison says, even if you say, well, okay, we can't make people not be factional, but why can't we make government less responsive to factions? Madison says that inevitably government legislators are going to be responsive to the temptations of faction. They'll be factional just like normal people. You can't remove the temptation because they're placed in the situation of deciding about laws which will apply to people and people like them. In particular, says Madison, because almost all governments and legislatures are going to decide about tax laws and laws about property, they'll be vulnerable to the most basic cause of factional behavior and factionalism, that is, different amounts of property and the interests that go with it. So basically, this argument boils down for Madison to ruling out the idea that you can get rid of factions, which to us seems reasonably simple. We have a pluralist notion that most of us grow up with and are taught, that politics is about sort of conflict between factional groups or interests. But Madison's opponents, the anti-federalists, really did have a more civic virtue-based idea about government. So we had to eliminate the idea that you could somehow stop government and stop people from being too factional. So what Madison says, if we're going to remove the effects of faction, if we're going to mitigate the effects of faction, it's going to be different depending on what kind of faction we look at. And remember that for Madison, there are sort of two subtypes of faction, minority factions and majority factions, and that for both of them, they're always going to have something that either damages the aggregate interest of the whole or the rights of the citizens in mind. So he says the simplest thing to do is rule half the factions out immediately. Use a system of majority rule, proportional representation, voting, majority rule of some kind automatically limits the amount of harm that minority factions can do to the system. Pretty simple. If you're a minority faction, you're going to have a hard time getting anything done if most policy is created through voting. The problem for Madison, though, is that if you adopt this solution in order to stop minority interests from creating factional problems, well, you're going to empower, you're going to give extra problems to the majority factions. These majority factions can be just as factious. Just because it's a majority doesn't mean its ideas aren't detrimental to the interests of the whole and won't damage the rights of other citizens. And now it's been extra empowered because it will always win in a system of majority rule that you adopted in order to stop minority factions from doing harm. So he says if you look at types of government, the more directly democratic a government is, the worse affected it will be by these mischiefs of faction, which is a very famous phrase of Madison's, because these majority factions will be ever more empowered the more democratic your government is. And so Madison says, what if we think about sort of mixed democracies? What about republics, which are representative democracies? They elect a small number of citizens in order to represent all of the other citizens, and they can extend much larger in terms of geographic reach and number of citizens because they don't require every person to be participating in the decisions. Madison says that it's pretty important to have this kind of a republican system because a smaller number of representatives will help to filter out factional interests. Since representatives are wiser, they'll have a better sense of civic duty than most citizens. And that's true even if you accept what he said at the beginning of the paper about the fact that wise statesmen won't always be in charge and you can't eliminate faction through having wise statesmen. You can't eliminate faction through having wise statesmen, but you can reduce its effects through a system of representation that will choose virtuous representatives and legislators. But he says, that's only a moderate guarantee. He doesn't really trust the people. They could elect demagogues. They could elect bad representatives. They could create a secret plot among the representatives. So what are you going to do? Well, if you create an ever larger republic with more and more representatives and groups of representatives, you're not going to be able to build a plot among the representatives, and a few bad apples are unlikely to cause problems. Similarly, the bigger the republic, the more people there are to choose from for representatives, and the larger total number of representatives. So the idea here is if you have a very small republic, in which let's say there are 50,000 citizens and 5 representatives, one bad representative is 1 out of 5. That could cause some serious problems, and it's easy for those 5 to get together and make all the policy in a factional way. Similarly, if you only have 50,000 people, there might only be 3 really smart, virtuous people among them. So you don't have enough for smart, civically virtuous representatives. For Madison, if you extend the republic, make it larger and more proportional, it's going to be harder for the representatives to build a little secret plot among themselves. You're going to have more chance of having good people in proportion to the population. And you're going to decrease the impact of each bad apple. Finally, he says, there are bigger constituencies, and the bigger the constituency, the less likely it will be to choose a really bad representative. So Madison is here making an argument for a Republican government, but particularly for a Republican government that extends over a very large constituency and a large geographic area. But, he says, this can have its own problems. The bigger your republic gets, even if it gets better and better at mitigating the effects of factions, it gets all the positiveness of a democracy that stops minority faction from being a problem and so on, it does have another problem. The bigger the republic, the harder it is to look at what are called gradations of interest, those little things that matter to people in Richmond that don't necessarily matter to people in Massachusetts. So the Constitution, he says, is going to include states. It's going to include republics within the very large republic. So the very large republic, the federal government, is going to do all of these things he's been discussing above about mitigating the effects of faction. But the smaller republics, the states, can perceive these gradations of interests among the people. Plus, he says, the more places that factions can coalesce and attempt to conflict, the more factions you can create, those factions will fight each other and check each other, decreasing the chance that any one minority or majority faction will be able to succeed. So Madison says, you can imagine that in a large and extended republic, you could have a faction which can dominate Rhode Island, but even if a faction dominates Rhode Island, it won't dominate the whole of the republic, and by dominating Rhode Island, it can't damage the rest of the republic very badly. So Federalist 10 is a long and very careful argument, where Madison starts out trying to identify the central problem of governance, which he says is factions, and then how either to eliminate faction or to control its effects, and then he looks at ways to control its effects and ends up deciding that a very large republic, that is the federal government, with mixed modes of representation and lots of smaller republics within it, that is the federal system of states, is going to provide the best means for controlling the damages that factions can do to the aggregate interest or to the rights of the citizens. So if you read along carefully, pausing this video, you should be able to follow that argument throughout Madison's piece in Federalist 10. Federalist 51 is a little bit more specific. Madison is trying to look at how, once you've created a government, you can control the exercise of its power. So it is theoretical, but it's not quite as philosophical in some ways as Federalist 10 is. So the first thing that Madison says is that citizens and the state itself, morality, how the documents are worded, none of this stuff is really sufficient to control the power of the government. This is a really cynical thing for Madison to say if you think about it. He's just written and is defending a constitution. And he says, constitutions are great, but if a government really wants to commit tyrannical acts, it's not going to pay attention to just some written document. Just having a document, whether it's a document that lists your rights, isn't enough. Nor is hoping that all of your legislators are, as the framers would have said, good Christians. Those things won't be sufficient to control a government. So what Madison says is that each specific branch should be able to limit the other branch, especially when it has extremely flexible powers. The more flexible the powers, the more flexible should be the constraints. But Madison says it's not enough just to give them the power to check one another, no matter how flexible. You also have to make them want to do it. Remember, this is all an attempt to find another way to control the possibility of government tyranny. If you can't do it with the document itself or morality, each branch has to have not only the flexible power at its disposal, but also the motivation or will to attack the other branch's exercise of tyrannical power. So, the idea that Madison says is, well, the first way you could try and do this is just have everybody directly elected by the people. So they all have a separate source of motive or will from the people. But you can't really do that, especially the judiciary. So if you go through and you read Madison's argument here, it's a pretty elaborate look at the way you want to create a separate institutional incentive, as a political scientist would say, for each branch. That's part of the reason the Senate is elected differently than the House in the original Constitution, is to give it a different source of motivation or will, even if that's not a direct election from the people. Well, there are always other ways, even if they have separate modes of election or sources of motivation and will, from one another. So the next thing Madison says is that each department has to make sure that it can't starve the other necessarily, that they don't have direct and immediate control over the actions of the other, that the House can't say, well, you're preventing me from being tyrannical, Mr. President, so we are just going to stop funding the entire executive department. Madison says that this is pretty easy to accomplish by making sure that in the Constitution, each branch has a separate addendum to make sure that it gets a salary. Interesting way to look at the otherwise antiquated seeming salary requirements in the Constitution. So Madison says once you've got this basic system set up where you have some election by the people, you have some basic separate sources of motive or will, and you have separate foundations for each department's power and independence through making sure that they are funded and have salaries separate from one another, Madison says the trickiest part now is really giving them the desire to check the other. They may have separate sources of motive or will, but will they want to actually check one another? This is where Madison's famous "men are not angels" comes in. Madison really thinks that the best way to give them this motive is to appeal to the self-interest of the people in each branch, so that it will be in their self-interest. They will desire to check each of the other branches. But the problem with Madison, or the problem for Madison, is that you have to carefully calibrate. You have to make sure that the powers and membership of one department, when you're giving it these desires, won't disempower another department. So Madison says the best way to do this, of course, would just be to give each department equal powers. But we like republics, as we established back in Federalist 10 and all the intervening Federalist papers. So we're going to have one branch that has a lot more power than all of the others, which is a tricky problem for the system of checks and separate sources of motivation that Madison wants to set up. So he says the first thing you can do is split this one most powerful branch into two halves, each of which will compete with and question one another. And those two halves are going to have separate sources of motivation or will and separate sources of election. So they'll have some motive to limit one another and not necessarily cooperate in tyrannical action. So that's one reason that Madison says we have the Senate and the House. to provide a way to dilute the otherwise overwhelming legislative power that is vested solely in the popularly elected branch in a republic. So the tricky thing here is that if you have the full and absolute power to make laws vested in the legislature, especially a popularly elected legislature, which Madison says you need, that weakens the executive, because the executive is nothing but a little pawn in the hands of the legislature. Madison then says, problem is you can't give the executive an absolute veto, so you have to tie the branches together in some way. There's a number of ways the Constitution does this. Just look at the role of the vice president, which today seems silly and, again, antiquated. But the role of the vice president is partly to give the Senate a tie to the president and weaken the importance of the president's veto, give them some communication to one another. Plus, the fact that you need both houses to overrule a presidential veto ties them together and gives them a common motive. Thus, you have this very complicated system wherein only the legislative can make laws, but they can't overcome a presidential veto separately, so they have to work together and in large amounts to overcome a veto, but it's not absolute. Right. So the problem for Madison is that he says, I know this system isn't perfect. It's always possible that the president and the two houses could cooperate, or you could get a two-thirds majority in both houses that would completely void the importance of the president in acting as a check. So this system of checks and balances and auxiliaries needs further checks and balances and auxiliaries. Doing that is, we'll have many governments. That strong power to legislate that's vested in the national legislature, well, it's not only vested in the national legislature, says Madison. There are reserved powers to the states and enumerated powers only for the federal government. So all of these smaller state governments that are protected in the federalism articles of the Constitution are going to be subdivided within themselves as well. Each one will have a republican form of government. Man, this is particularly interesting. So he says not only will you subdivide the federal government and provide branches the means and motive to check one another while sticking with the Republican principle of having the legislative branch most powerful, but you'll have an additional check from all of these other governments that are simultaneously doing the exact same thing. They're subdivided according to what he calls the abilities and interests model. So this should give you a clue as to where you should be in your read-along with Federalist 51 here. So then Madison says we've got another problem. If we've checked the particular government, if we've checked the representatives, the legislators, the executive, if they're all intertwined in a system of mutual motives to stop one another, what if the will of the people becomes the problem? What if you have an overwhelming popular majority that wants negative things? This would be the same problem of majority faction that Madison talked about in Federalist 10, but now he's talking about it in the context of the governmental branches and the powers and balances they have against one another. And here's where Madison's second argument for the federal system comes in. He says what happens is you stop these gigantic majorities that can dominate the national legislature from forming. You increase the number of people, the number of groups, and the areas in which they can contest their interest. So, for example, Madison would say a tiny little town where the only industry is basket weaving, that's going to be really easy to create a massive popular majority for something bad. But if you have many different industries, many different groups of people, things like that, you're going to have the pluralism solution that Madison is discussing here. So what Madison says is Confederation governments can't do this. Confederation governments actually encourage lots of powerful popular majorities that will form and overcome, no matter how carefully balanced the powers of the legislature and the executive are in each individual state. They're not divided according to what Madison calls these abilities and interests or separate motives and means. So when you create a large federal republic, a large complex federal republic, you can prevent these majorities from emerging at the national level, and you can prevent them from being as powerful at the state level because the national government will have some powers that the state governments don't get. So ultimately, when majorities can't emerge, says Madison, and they can't exercise this radical power through, no matter how well checked, a Republican government, he says this is the brilliant part. You don't need a king. You don't need external securities, as he calls them. You don't need additional checks on government. By creating not only the internal checks within the system of government itself, the subdivision of the legislative branch, the ties to the executive branch, all that sort of stuff. But you also create these federal republics, there is less need to build in things that could later lead to tyranny. There's less temptation to abandon the system as a whole. Plus, and this is sort of a last point Madison tacks on to the end, if a majority does emerge in a federal system in which each branch is checked and balanced and all that good stuff, it's probably going to be a majority about something really good and really important. So Federalist 10 and Federalist 51 are quite different. Federalist 10 is about the basic concept of faction and how the proposed constitutional system will reduce the effects of faction, while Federalist 51 is about the effects of majorities and the structures of government and how you can both structure government and its size and extent through a federal system to limit the effects of faction. But they both, and it's quite important as we move into the federalism unit, hit on the idea that federalism is an important part of the whole system of checks and balances, the whole system of republicanism. My last note is a historical one. Madison didn't necessarily believe his own argument. Federalist 10 and Federalist 51 are, at least partly, there primarily to make the anti-federalists less afraid. Madison didn't really like the amount of power that state governments had and the amount of sovereignty they were guaranteed under the new federal system. But in Federalist 10 and 51, he had to make sure to highlight those elements of the constitutional system because they were the ones that the anti-federalists were most worried about. So they're good arguments, and they provide a lot of insight into the way Madison theorized, but you have to remember that they occurred in a historical context which is pretty complex. This has really boiled down the two papers. And remember my suggestion that what you should have done, or should go back and do, is pause and read through Fed 10 and Fed 51 as you're listening to these, so you can see the argument that Madison is making. Hopefully this gives you a quick reminder of what we did in class with 10 and 51. It's a little bit simplified, it's a lot simplified, but it's a basic look at Madison's argument, which you can use as a review. Thanks, guys.